Hello, everyone. Andrew Elizaga here, welcoming you to another episode of the Dubcast with Dubside.
And this is Dubside here as well, and here we are again.
Now, a question came up recently from a listener that I thought we could talk about.
All right.
What makes a kayak a Greenland-style kayak? It's actually a good question because when I first started out, it wasn't really clear to me what features characterized a Greenland-style kayak, especially when you're looking at some of the modern kayaks that were available.
Yeah, well, I imagine the question could have a number of answers. It's like trying to define what makes the geographical area of the Arctic. You could define it as anywhere that's above the tree line. You could decide it's anywhere above a certain latitude, or you could decide among the temperature range. You sort of have to take your pick as to which is which. So with a kayak, yeah, you could say it's the hard chines and the low volume. Or you could say anything that's a skin-on-frame kayak, you could consider it a Greenland-style kayak. Well, I'm sure that people would argue against that. When you have the Kayaks, like I'll be talking about in this Dubcast, with the ones from the Aleuts.
So what characteristics do you think would define Greenland style? You want to take a stab at it?
Well, not being a kayak designer or a super experienced kayak builder myself, I would define it in very general terms. So as I said, low volume with hard chines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you can point to the positive shear, which means that the ends are upswept. Some modern kayaks actually have a pretty flat shear, or maybe even a reverse shear, where the ends go down. The rake on both the bow and the stern, compared to some modern kayaks like the Epic kayaks have a plumb bow.
Yeah, okay.
And an ocean cockpit, a small cockpit opening.
But all these definitions have exceptions or things. People will take the Greenland design, and since we're not used to the cramped cockpit, some people don't like, so they'll make a much larger keel cockpit. Everything else is the same, just the cockpit's much bigger. And you can debate whether that's a Greenland kayak or not, but
there are no hard and fast rules for what make a Greenland kayak.
Yeah.
And I think the deeper you look into it, the harder it is to get a definitive answer because there's so much variety.
Yeah.
Even in the traditional Greenland kayaks, for instance, if you look at Harvey Golden's book, Kayaks of Greenland, there's an incredible amount of variety in the designs.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where the more you know about it, the more confused and less dogmatic you become. One way to look at it, I think, is to look at where the design came from. So every kayak has a designer who usually bases the design on an existing design or designs, and those designs are often drawings or surveys of traditional Arctic kayaks. Did you know Ken Taylor?
Yeah, I met him once or twice. He came to the Delaware event many years back.
Do you know the story of his kayak?
The one that was built for him in 1959 when he first went to Greenland with John Heath, I believe.
Yeah. At the time, he was a student at Glasgow University in Scotland, and he spent the summer of 1959 living in Greenland and learning about kayaks and hunting seals from kayaks. And while he was there, he had a kayak built for him by one of the village kayak builders, and he had to gather a bunch of seal skins in order to get that skin. But he went back to Scotland with a seal skin kayak that became the model for a lot of recreational kayaks that were built at the time, including the Valley Kayaks NS Acuta.
Yeah.
A guy named Duncan Winning made a drawing of Ken Taylor's kayak, and in the 1960s, Jeffrey Blanchard modified the design for a larger paddler and built it out of plywood. And someone looked at that kayak and made a plug for a fiberglass kayak that became the NS Acuta.
Yeah.
There you have the lineage of what we call a recreational sea kayak that came from a Greenland kayak. So you could say definitely the NS Acuta is a Greenland-style sea kayak.
Yeah.
And in contrast, Derek Hutchinson based his kayaks not on the Greenland kayaks, but on his first kayak was based on the Mackenzie River Delta kayak, a drawing in Adney and Chappelle's Bark Canoes and Skinboats of North America.
Yeah.
So it's not a Greenland-style kayak.
Yeah. I would imagine he needed more volume for expedition just to put stuff in his kayak. So the Greenland kayaks were never made for that kind of thing. You were out hunting seals. So I can see Derek pretty early on would just gravitate towards something with some more space in it.
Yeah. The Greenland style just happens to fit in very well with what we like to do as hobbyists.
Yeah. Well, they roll very well. And there's also something to be said for how cool they look.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you there. You know, it's a funny thing. I've never seen a double or a tandem Greenland kayak. Is there such a thing?
Not in Greenland. I don't believe that was ever done traditionally. To carry lots of big things or to move a whole settlement, they would use the umiaks, the big rowboats.
Okay, yeah.
The guys would paddle their kayaks, and the women and all this stuff would go in the umiak.
Now, in contrast, I believe that the tandem kayak was the rule in the Aleut kayaking culture.
Yeah. I don't know if it was the rule or maybe the 50% of the kayaks, but yeah, it was certainly a common sight was the double.
Mm-hmm. What about rudders? If a kayak has a rudder on it, could it be called a Greenland-style kayak? What do you think?
Well, not by me. I'm not sure where the rudder actually came from, but it's usually said by experienced instructors. You can with the proper technique, you don't need a rudder. You can control using the right edging and skills. You can get the kayak to go in a straight line. But then the counter argument is if you're doing a extended crossing of 10 or 20 miles with a side wind, your day goes a lot easier with a rudder.
Yeah, that's what I've been told is also. With the proper kayak design and skills, you don't need a rudder. Although you might need a skeg.
The rudder is one of those things where it's prone to failure, and when you really, really need it, that's when it's going to fail. So the traditional kayaks did not have skegs either. They might have tied a little skeg on that didn't move, but the skeg we see today in plastic and fiberglass ones, the one that retracts, that's a more modern invention, which seems to be the best compromise between a full-fledged rudder and nothing at all. Even the skegs are prone to failure as well. There's cables getting kinked and the thing gets stuck and it won't come out.
Yeah. The Greenlanders do, though, have those removable skegs. And when I first made my second skin-on-frame kayak, I put a skeg on it, a removable skeg. And one problem with it is it can get knocked out of alignment, and then you're really in trouble because you're just going in one direction.
Yeah. If you're in the middle of a race and your skeg is not on straight, you will not do very well in the race. I see in the competition that when they're tying their skegs on, or they'll screw them on in various ways to attach them, and they're looking down and taking careful adjustment to make sure it's exactly straight on, because they saw the best racers do that because they know how important that is.
Okay, well, before we get on with Dubcast number 21, just want to say thanks to our listeners. We appreciate your questions and comments, so keep them coming. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to Ken Taylor's blog, where he writes about his experience kayaking and living with the seal hunters in West Greenland in 1959. It's an amazing story with some pretty awesome photos as well.
Mm-hmm.
So on to the Dubcast. What do you have for us on episode 21?
So this talks about when I lived in Anacortes at the place of Corey Freedman and his Spirit Line kayaks. And he made the Kayaks, as we call them. So I was there for a year. Had some very interesting times there, which I'll talk about.
So we'll go ahead and get started.
All right. Welcome to the Dubcast with Dubside. This is Dubcast number 21. An introduction to the Aleut kayak tradition of southern Alaska and my time in Anacortes, Washington, and a guy named
Corey Freedman. And we'll have some Greenlandic music. Maybe at some point I'll get into Aleut music. But it's not quite as easy to find as Greenlandic music. So in the Arctic, there were the Inuit people inhabiting Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. And they used kayaks all through those regions. And there is a distinctly different but related group of people that inhabited the southern part of Alaska on the islands off the southwest tip of Alaska. And these people were known as the Aleuts. And over the centuries, the Aleut people developed their particular kayak to suit their conditions and their activities. And they refer to their vessel as an ikiak instead of a kayak. Ikiak. And you notice some differences right away in looking at an ikiak. They often have what we call a bifurcated bow. So the bow has 2 points, one above the other, and the one sort of sits more in the water and the other is over the water. The stern looks a little different as well. It comes to a point in the middle and then it kind of bulges out to the sides a little more than a narrow Greenland kayak that just comes to one point. An ikiak also has rounder edges, and the construction inside facilitates that. There's multiple chines that the skin wraps around in a more of a smooth shape. And another big difference is that the ikiak was often made as a tandem with 2 people, 2 cockpits, longer with 2 people paddling it, and there are also ones made for 3 people. These Aleutian Islands are in a very unique geographic position. They extend through the open ocean for about 1,000 miles, and they lie all in a latitude lower than every part of Greenland. So to develop kayaks for this region, you're not going to have very much ice and snow to worry about, but you are going to want to paddle for very long distances in heavy wind conditions. So the Aleuts had quite a culture with these ikiaks, and they had figured out how to hunt seals, how to fish, how to hunt whales even, and how to travel between these islands over this 1,000-mile range of islands. And things were, I suppose, going fairly okay until 1741, when Russians started coming and exploring these islands. And things did not go so well after that. Sea otters were one thing the Aleuts would hunt, and the Russians had quite a market for sea otter pelts back in the mainland cosmopolitan areas. So the abundance of these sea otters brought fur traders from the mainland in Russia and started to actually eventually enslaved the Aleutian people to hunt sea otter pelts. And this continued to where the Russians made up their own name for the ikiak. They call it a badarka, which is often used to this day, but we like to use the original ikiak term for their watercraft. Well, the Russians organized big expeditions with large flotillas, even hundreds of ikiaks, with Russians in 3-hole badarkas, a Russian in the middle with an Aleut person on each end paddling, and the other Aleuts in their own ikiaks. And they would take them as far south as California. And this, over time, had a devastating impact on the sea otter population and also had a devastating impact on the Aleut population. The number of Aleuts dropped to about a tenth of its original size. 1867, the U.S. bought Alaska, acquiring the Aleutian Islands. Then in World War II, the Aleutian Islands were unfortunately in a strategic location for world wars. And on one end of the chain, the Japanese were occupying them and taking the locals prisoner. And coming down the other end, the U.S. decided to relocate the Aleut people, which amounted to putting them in internment camps and taking them away from the areas they had learned to hunt and fish for generations and had buried their ancestors there as well. The U.S. government did much later issue an apology for the internment, similar to the apology issued for the Japanese Americans interned during World War II. But the damage was done. Today there are maybe 10,000, 11,000 people considering themselves Aleut. And the Aleutian language is spoken by reportedly less than 200 people, which does not bode well for the survival of the language. And there are attempts to keep the Kayak knowledge and history alive. It's not quite as thriving as the things like the championships in Greenland, but they're doing what they can. Unfortunately, at this point, you can't really find an Aleut hunter to ask him the details of what it was like to hunt. You know, how do you hunt whales? I mean, we know from the record that they used poison harpoons, and then they would wait for the whale to wash up after the poison had killed it. But there's a lot more of the actual mechanics of how these things were done that there's just no one to ask that can tell you in person what it was like. And in Greenland, we have talked to old seal hunters who did it themselves, but the Aleut historical record is a little more spotty, unfortunately. But it is a very amazing culture. They made clothing from intestines of animals and had these looked like kind of raincoats with strips and strips of the dried intestines. There is another very distinctive feature of Aleutian culture, and that is they would make these hats that the hunter in a Kayak would wear, and they were very ornate, and they came to, I think they were made of wood on the inside with other feathers and things to decorate it, and they were used, of course they shaded the sun from the eyes of a hunter. They might have been some acoustic feature of being able to hear animals, but that's not known for sure. But we have examples of these in museums and pictures and things, and the Greenlanders didn't have headgear like that, but the Aleutians certainly had something going on with the cool-looking hats. Well, there are non-Aleuts who have taken to the Aleut culture and are helping to keep it alive in various forms, and I'd like to tell you about one such person, and his name is Freedman, and he has a business called Spirit Line Kayaks, and he builds Kayaks at his location north of Seattle in Anacortes, a town which is very close to Deception Pass that I told you about previously. Well, in 2005, I got an invitation to relocate to Washington State and make DVDs, instructional DVDs about the traditional Greenland paddling full-time. And I took that opportunity, and I first lived out in that area at Corey's place. He has, he kind of described it as a sprawling compound tucked back in the woods outside of Anacortes. And he's got several structures there, sheds and barns and things with all his equipment and materials and tools and machinery in there to make Kayaks. And there was a mobile home trailer on the back lot, and I lived in that mobile home trailer for a year. I'd like to take this opportunity to clear up one falsehood about me. And on the internet for many years, since back then in 2005 or 6, somebody has posted that I lived in a treehouse. And that is actually not true. I think that came about because living at Corey has a treehouse on his property that other people have stayed in. It's about 10 feet off the ground. I never actually lived in that treehouse, but somebody must have assumed that I did when they wrote up what they knew about me. But that never actually was the case. There is a small pond on the property. It's about the size of maybe 3 swimming pools. And when I first came there, that was my initial question. How deep is that pond? Can I roll a kayak in that pond? And Corey said, it's all murky. It's black water there. I don't know if you want to get in that. But it was the leaves falling off the trees. It's a very wooded property. That the tannic acid from the leaves just made the water black. That didn't bother me though, because I started rolling in Philadelphia. So it turned out that that pond did have one little spot that was maybe 4 or 5 feet deep enough to do the sculling roll. So that was my personal practice pond for rolling while I lived there. Rather interesting assortment of animals around the property there. You had there was a duck in the pond, and the duck's name was Lucky. And the story went that a pair of ducks nested on that pond for a bit, and they had 5 little ducklings. And then the ducklings, I guess, stayed there for a while. But in that area, there are coyotes. You'd hear them at night prowling all around. And there were 5 little ducklings, and then there were 4 little ducklings, and then there were 3 little ducklings, and the coyotes were going to work over time. And eventually there was just 1 duck that had become an adolescent and started to grow into a mature duck. And that was the last of the 5. And when I lived there, that duck was there the whole time, and that's why they called it Lucky, because the coyotes never got that duck. So I shared my rolling pond with Lucky. Corey had quite a collection of dogs from time to time, and he also had an African gray parrot, which could talk, and the parrot's name was Zulu. And the parrot would hear people answering the phone or asking about Corey. And so this parrot, one of his phrases that it picked up was, "Where's Corey? Where's Corey? Where's Corey? Where's Corey?" Some of the people there would talk to the parrot, try to tell him, "No, Corey, he went to the store," as if the parrot could understand. And I don't know, maybe the parrot could understand. I don't know. Corey told me that later the African gray parrot might have gotten done in by a hawk or something. Anyway, he lost the parrot, but he's replaced Zulu with several other birds, which I'm not sure if they can all talk, but he's got the birds going on there. And a very colorful cast of characters would pass through there. Some people would come to build a Kayak, and staying for a week to build it, or it might take 2 or 3 weeks, and some people would camp out on the property, and other people would stay there, or he employed a few people there, and some of their friends would come, so there was quite a number of people passing through. And there was a local kid, teenager, who came for a while, and he didn't have the money to build his own Kayak, but he was fascinated by the whole thing. And so he worked out a deal with Corey where he would help out around the shop and do various cleanup tasks and whatever things Corey had for him to do, in exchange for Corey would let him build his own Kayak. And so over the course of a couple weeks, he'd be there on a regular basis, and he was really excited about it and just quite enthusiastic about the whole process, where you start with making the frame, and then you lash the ribs on, and then you finish it off with an application of Corey's Goop. And this is an exclusive Corey product. It's a 2-part urethane finish. And if you're making skin-on-frame kayaks, you can paint them and then sand the paint and paint it again until it's nice and smooth, and keep on painting and sanding, which is what they do in Greenland, or there's various other things you can get. But Corey has this stuff that has become quite popular to make. It's works very well for putting as the finish on the skin of a kayak. And so he sells that. People are ordering it and they're shipping it out all the time. So this kid, he finishes his Ikiak finally, and he's quite proud of it. So he's going to take it out for the maiden voyage. And Corey would be come and go, and the other people would be coming and going. So sometimes the workshop, the area wasn't locked up, so people could just come and work on something if Corey wasn't there. And so the kid, the finish is dry. The Corey goop is dried on this thing, and he's painted it just right. And he came with a friend of his to take it on the maiden voyage. And he was going to go out to the north end of Anacortes there, where there's a channel that goes across to Guimas Island, with a current coming through there. So he puts it. He's got a car he comes over with. He puts it up on his car, and then his friend wants to go paddling with him. So he needs another Ikiak. So he looks around. There's Ikiaks in various stages of finish or repair all over the place. So he finds one that's all intact, and they puts them on the car, and they found some piece of rope or something to tie it on with, and they head out down the road, and they get outside up the hill on the driveway and go out to the main road, and before long, he must have just had one or two thin pieces of rope. Anyway, the things break off. The wind takes it right off the vehicle, and they fly into the air and manage to hit another car and hit the windshield and smash the windshield. And the other driver, I don't think, was seriously injured, but it was a very bad scene. And I believe the kid's father knew the driver of the car that got hit. There was people on the island that know each other. Maybe without lawyers getting involved. They worked it out with the guy, however they resolved that. But it turned out that the kayak, the Ikiak that this kid had borrowed for his friend, happened to be Corey's prized Ikiak, one he'd had for a long time that had a very nice finish on it, and his special Ikiak, the last one he would have lent anybody to use. And in the mishap, it had damaged that one bad enough so that you'd have to take the skin off to repair it, and the skin was part of the exclusive aspect of it that Corey liked very much. So it was a really bad scene. And the kid, I think he had to work out somewhere. He would spend like maybe the next 6 months or something to come and help out the shop to make up for this damage he lost. They had some arrangement worked out. I don't know if the kid ever really made good on it. I didn't see him anymore after that. He got so discouraged that the whole thing went sour so bad that it made him completely lose interest in the whole project. So if we can draw a lesson from this, it is that you must learn how to properly fasten any kayak onto the roof of a car to avoid a similar mishap. And we use these cam lock straps. They have a metal buckle that you slide the webbing into and pull it tight. And even though the cam is designed so it won't loosen up by itself, still any experienced kayaker will still take the end of it after it goes through the cam lock and wrap that end around tightly to secure that as well. So even if the cam lock fails, it'll hold. And so you need two of these straps and a solid roof rack, and that's how you put a kayak onto the roof of a car. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can take the bow and stern and line some those to the bumper or the fender to get even more secure. And I often see people say, "Well, we're not going that far." They'll tie something on quickly, and I'll say, "It's not how far you go; it's how fast you go." And so one other note is that bungee cords do not cut it for tying any boat to the top of a car. You want real straps. You can use rope, and there's a trucker's hitch, a special knot to get the tension on it, but don't use bungee cords. And if you don't really want to mess with this whole putting a boat on top of a car idea, you can do what I do and use a folding kayak, and then you just take it apart and you put it inside the car. Accidents and mishaps tend to generate laws and restrictions and regulations. I was in Argentina, and the area I was in, they had a law that prohibited putting anything on top of a car that protruded over the ends of the car, which effectively meant you could not strap a kayak on top of a car and be legal. That was their regulation. You had to get a trailer to put your kayaks on, which really limited the viability of kayaking as a leisure activity. So in traditional sea kayaking, this whole branch of Kayaks and Aleut culture is another part of it. And the Kayaks have, they may have been faster in general than a Greenland kayak design. The Aleuts had the speed thing worked out, and the paddle was somewhat different as well. It came more pointed on the ends, and the one side of it was flat, the other side had a ridge down the middle, so that there are differences there, and somewhat of a different paddling technique, but not quite as much of that is fully understood the way the Greenland techniques are. And when it came to rolling, the Aleuts, they may have known how to roll, but they didn't push it to the lengths that Greenlanders did with hand rolls and brick rolls and rolling with the elbow and straitjacket rolls. And the Kayak is, the back deck isn't really as low as the Greenland kayak, so it doesn't lend itself to being the rolling machine that you see that a Greenland design is. Well, if you ever rent kayaks at a place that caters to beginners, they'll often have double tandem kayaks, big, wide, stable, like barge things that don't tip over very easily. But that is not the Aleut style. Their Kayaks were a lot narrower and much faster than that. When they set up the Greenland competition in the late 1980s, it was to keep the Greenland tradition alive. Then in 2000, they opened it up to foreigners, and not fully cognizant of how that would work out. There was some unknowns there. So they made a category for tandem kayaks. It was going to be the Greenlandic class, and there was the international class, and the international class for double kayaks, and international class for single kayaks, because they'd seen that there were double kayaks where they had them places that these rental places I talked about. They double kayaks existed, so they figured, well, foreigners are going to come compete. They'll have to have a category for double kayaks, because we don't want the double kayaks don't really compete against single kayaks. It wouldn't be fair. So we'll have a separate category for the tandem kayaks. I don't believe that anyone has ever taken them up on that and entered in as a tandem thing, because you'd be competing all by yourself. There's nobody else that does that. So it's still in the book somewhere. It says the tandem division, but I think that's only on paper at this point. No one ever actually made that work out in practice. Well, the kayak events in this country, particularly ones with a traditional side, you'll see the Kayaks here and there. They're not that rare to find. And you'll see the Aleutian paddles as well. People use those. I've even seen carbon fiber Aleut paddles. People have tried making those. So that culture survives one way or another. And I'm not aware that anybody's doing any sort of competition in the Aleutian Islands the way the Greenlanders are, but maybe at some point in the future something like that can get underway. Greenland music selection this week is from a group called Isummat. Isummat would translate to, that could be like belief, meaning, faith, something like that, as a noun, the faith. This was a group, these people go back a ways. This was recorded in the year 2000, and the chief vocalist and one of the main songwriters, a woman named Bilunguak Lunge. And she went on to do some other projects and write some songs for other people. I don't know if she is currently still making music or sort of retired from it. But this goes back to 2000. And so the song we're going to hear it's a song called Sekinek, meaning sun. One of those, inspired by the weather. And they do it they have kind of a reggae touch to it, but I'll give you more of a straightforward version. Lyrics talk about, see the sun, the water, the ice, and then how beautiful it is. And I guess she's enjoying the outdoors, celebrating the environment. So here is Sekinek by Bilunguak Lunge.
Chakua Sekinek nueso Chakua Aputato Chakua Sikupeuto Chakua Asaveso Guna Esse vitacué Ele se de mami Esse vitacué E makishla eso Dasa istit na menekama Uanga nuna put Ashla nitamanit Kusana ne uso Asana ne uso Kusana ne uso Asana ne uso
So I'll tell you how I discovered that song. In the lunchroom at the competition, where people hang out before and after meals, there's a guy who comes to the events named Ungak Tobiasen. And if you recall in Dubcast 17, I talked about Pavia Tobiasen, who was one of the top rollers at the time. Well, Ungak is his younger brother. And Ungak is actually the Greenlandic word for harpoon, so he is named after the harpoon. And Ungak is quite musically inclined, and he'll bring his guitar, acoustic guitar, to the cafeteria, sing some songs, and I've got my handy little recording device in my pocket, so I snoop in on his playing. And so he sang that song, and it kind of sounded familiar, so I had to go back home and go through all my CDs till I found out which one it was. And then if I'm lucky, the CD has the words printed out, makes it easier to learn them. Now, Ungak is a very cool dude, and I know he didn't think he was being recorded, so I don't want to embarrass him by putting him on stage. So this is just a casual thing. This isn't a totally together performance. He'd sound a lot better in the studio, I'm sure, if they recorded him that way. But what I got here has got way too much guitar and not enough vocal, but I'll let you hear it anyway. So certain songs have become standards in the Greenland musical vocabulary, and that is one of them, often done at sing-along type of things. Song is called Sekinek, Sequineq, meaning sun. And that is the third track off of Looks like the CD is titled Isummat, and the group is titled the same thing, Isummat. And you can find this on the atlanticmusic.gl website and purchase it yourself. Isummat, Isummat. Coming up in number 22, I'm going to tell you about Air Greenland. That is the Greenland Airlines, which is what it takes to go to Greenland. Unless you find a cruise ship that goes there, which some do. But every time I go to Greenland, I fly Air Greenland. And I've done it enough times that a number of interesting things have occurred. I'll tell you about that next time.